He speaks in your voice American, and there's a shine in his eye that's halfway hopeful. I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and I'd like to discuss where not to start with Don DeLillo. DeLillo is a prolific novelist. He's been publishing books for about 50 years at this point. And despite being successful, despite winning a National Book Award with White Noise, having Underworld regarded as this sort of majestic masterpiece, being regarded as a major writer in the US over the past half century in some circles, DeLillo doesn't seem to inspire that same cult of very devoted readers that his contemporaries Thomas Pynchon, certainly Cormac McCarthy possess. Even a younger writer like David Foster Wallace seems to have that very focused coterie of readers who were just chomping at the bit to read anything that the writer would publish. And yet, I think in many ways, Don DeLillo belongs in that conversation. The ideas he was interested in as a novelist, the themes he was exploring are deeply relevant, not just to the 20th century, but here in the 21st century. There are many ways in which he was a very prescient novelist, and he was understanding the trends, the trajectories that were happening, not just in society here in the US, but also globally. And he's a man who's interested in shadows. He's interested in the threads that underlie the stitches in the fabric of society. He wants to know what happens to those threads when the stitches start to unravel, when pieces pull apart. And he's very masterful in depicting that, in depicting the danger that can exist both in a community and for a lone individual. And for those reasons, I think he's a deeply relevant writer. He's someone who should be read. But again, he's prolific. So where does one start? There are some, I think, pitfalls in approaching a writer like DeLillo, who has numerous works. And there are certainly, I think, some places that can lead to dead ends in his writing. So I'd like to give just a quick overview of who he is as a writer, and then get into some places that I wouldn't recommend starting. And I'll end with a few places that I would recommend starting. So DeLillo, I think fundamentally is fascinated by, as he writes, the cults of the famous and the dead. And that is a key through line in so many of his works. He's fascinated by the idea of celebrity and what that meant in the 20th century, what it has meant in the 21st century, the different types of celebrity exist, the dangers that come with celebrity, the loss of self, the sense that a celebrity's self is shattered and torn apart and little pieces dotted and given to all these individuals in the same way that a writer's self and life could be torn apart and given to all of the readers in the audience. And so I think that's an idea that has fascinated him nearly from the beginning. And so that's a real through line across his books. He's also a writer who's interested in the capacity for fiction to probe at ideas. He says in one interview in 1988, he famously said, "Fiction rescues history from its confusions." And he was sort of talking about what he was attempting to do with the great novel Libra, which I'll discuss later. But on a deeper level, DeLillo was identifying, we can have all sorts of books around culture, around what's happening, and yet in a certain way, fiction allows us to idealize aspects and to really abstract out whatever's irrelevant and focus on the aspects of society and on the individuals in society who most deeply fascinate us. And to understand them, and through that to understand ourselves, to allow celebrity and that sense of cult, of danger, to be a prism that refracts our understanding of ourselves. And it's really quite fascinating. I think he's also interested in the idea of media and the mediums that exist for media, particularly film and early novel America. His early novel, Americana, is focused on film. Running Dog involves film. Underworld, famously, Point Omega. And so the concept of film is very critical across a number of his novels. And then he's also someone who's interested in objects, the baseball in Underworld, a film that's being chased across Running Dog. The idea that objects can have their own celebrity, the mountain tapes in Great Jones Street, that as people become so fixated on things and this consumer mindset that existed not just in the US, but certainly in the US, but it was existing globally, that DeLillo finds that his characters become so fascinated by objects that they impute some power and strength to that object that almost defines their purpose and their character. And so I think those are all ideas that are percolating in Don DeLillo's novels. And that's why he's worth reading. I want to read one selection to give a sense of what that can sound like. This is from Libra. What happens in Miami? Ferry took a while to finish chewing his food. Think of two parallel lines, he said. One is the life of Lee H. Oswald. One is the conspiracy to kill the president. What bridges the space between them? What makes a connection inevitable? There is a third line. It comes out of dreams, visions, intuitions, prayers, out of the deepest levels of the self. It's not generated by cause and effect like the other two lines. It's a line that cuts across causality, cuts across time. It has no history that we can recognize or understand, but it forces a connection. It puts a man on the path of his destiny. And I think that in many ways is a quintessential paragraph explaining what DeLillo believes about our lives, that so many of us seem to have these individual hopes and lives, and his characters in his novels have this, and yet as they collide with history, as they connect to what seems like a fate, what seems like destiny, that there is this greater purpose that just seems to explode out. So, if that's a writer worth paying attention to, where might we not want to start? Well, I would recommend not starting with Americana. I don't have a copy of it up here because it is just flat out not a well-written book. DeLillo himself has said this. I've seen folks sort of identify like, oh, there's really masterful shades of what he's going to become. I don't find them in there. I think most folks don't find any shades of who Don DeLillo will be as a novelist in there. It's poorly written. If it did not have his name on it and he had not developed, 10 years later into a great novelist, I don't think the book would be in print. I wouldn't recommend ever bothering to read it, truly. Another place I wouldn't start with his short stories in The Angel Esmeralda. Some folks like to approach a writer through short stories or short novels, and Don DeLillo has a number of very, very strong short novels. Point Omega, The Silence, both are very excellent, strong short novels. But his short stories, for whatever reason, in The Angel Esmeralda, just don't quite work. I think he's a writer who really is interested in a number of books in sustaining a single metaphor. And he does that in End Zone. He does that in Point Omega, Mao 2, and even in The Silence, he seems to be doing that. Yet, in his short stories, it just doesn't quite work. It never seems to extend far enough to feel meaningful, to feel quite as developed, as relevant, as dangerous, as seductive as he achieves in his longer works. So I wouldn't recommend The Angel and Esmeralda as a starting point, despite the fact that it's shorter and it's going to take you a lot less time to read one of those stories than to read even one of his shorter novels. The other place I wouldn't recommend starting with Underworld. Underworld is an incredible book. The final pages of Underworld feature what is likely Don DeLillo's very best writing. But I think Underworld is best approached as a real capstone to Don DeLillo's work. It's a book that I think he was thinking about and working towards. And in many ways, it's the roof of a building that he has been constructing in his previous novels. And starting out 10, 15 years before Underworld, reading through 2-3 of his books before approaching Underworld really helps it all to fall into place, I think, to feel very complete. So Underworld, despite being a fantastic book, is not where I would recommend starting with Don DeLillo. Although it's a great book. If you dive into it, you might really enjoy it. The last one that I think could be a bit of a trap would be Mao 2. Mao 2 is a good book, but I think that the real world context of Mao 2 in some ways, I don't want to say overshadows, but almost buttresses the book and makes readers want to approach it as having more significance, more meaning than perhaps it actually does, and particularly in the aftermath of the horrifying attack on Salman Rushdie, because the original fatwa against Rushdie was one of the inspirations for Mao 2. Mao 2 is focused on sort of 2 stories. One of them is about a writer, a reclusive writer, whose life is suddenly, in danger, and it was inspired by Rushdie's experiences. It was inspired by Salinger being, sort of stalked, essentially. It was inspired by folks trying to get pictures of Thomas Pynchon. And DeLillo was trying to process how, all of those dangerous aspects of celebrity and fame in Mao 2. But the book itself is not necessarily equal to the task that he or perhaps the world had set for it. Again, it's good, but it's not great. And so I think a reader might be disappointed reading that book. So if those aren't places to necessarily start, where should one start with Don DeLillo? Well, great place to start, of course, is White Noise. White Noise is sort of the book that broke him out of the doldrums, pushed him into sort of a literary consciousness, if not a national consciousness. And it's a very strong book. I think it features some very clever writing. It's the book that has the great line about the cults of the famous and the dead. And there's a film adaptation coming out. So, White Noise is a great place to start. Some folks have read White Noise and really hated it. There are some ways in which White Noise is not a quintessential Don DeLillo book. He focuses on the concept of paranoia, the concept of catastrophe, and what it means to process catastrophe both globally and individually. And he does all that very well. It's also a book that sort of really starts to get into the concept of consumption and being a consumer, and how people are sort of conned into consumption. So White Noise could be a great place to start. Certainly Libra, if one has any fascination with the JFK assassination, as 9-year-old Rambling Raconteur Jack did. Libra is an excellent novel. I think there are many moods in which I prefer Libra to Underworld, personally, as a reader. I think it has some tremendous writing. I think the way in which he gets at his ideas around conspiracy, and again, that concept that fiction is rescuing history from its confusions, is achieved really well here. I have a whole video on Libra that I'll link in the description notes, but this might be a great place to start, particularly if you're interested in sort of U.S. history. Sort of a dark horse pick for where to start is the book that I think real deep fans of Don DeLillo believe should have been his White Noise, should have been the book that pushed him out into the consciousness, and that's The Names. The Names is an earlier book from the 1980s, and I believe all three of The Names, White Noise, and Libra are going to be published by Library of America in sort of a Don DeLillo 80s volume, which might be a great place to pick that up and get started. But The Names is not so much located in the US, which is interesting. It gives sort of a different vibe, a different feel to a writer who in many ways feels very Americana, as his first novel was titled, who locates so much of what he's writing about in New York City. Even in Libra, he wants to have, get it at Lee Oswald's childhood there in New York City. The Names is unique in that he tries to remove a little bit of that and has it in Greece, across Western Asia, India. And the concept, though, of danger, of paranoia, of like small movements of people, cults, is all certainly present here in The Names. And so that is a book that I think a number of folks really enjoy, and one that I would say, hey, if it sounds like from that reading that Don DeLillo is a writer for you, consider starting with The Names and following through those three books in the 1980s. Now, my personal sort of favorite is Running Dog. Running Dog is a wild, strange book. It's a book that I think really gets at just how strange and warped Don DeLillo's view of humanity, of individuals, can be. It's a book that's influenced by the Vietnam War, that's influenced by all sorts of individuals whose lives have sort of been shattered, or who are questing and searching for something that perhaps turns out to be not only not what they were expecting, or less than they were expecting, but ultimately much more dangerous than they were expecting, without it being quite, the holy grail they hoped for. And so this is a book that's shorter. It's sort of a crime novel in some ways, and it's very strange, but it's deeply effective. He has many other books. End Zone is an extended metaphor if you want to understand football and nuclear war. Players, in many ways, kind of, I think, forms a group with aspects of The Names, but certainly Silence, his recent book from 2020 that is almost sort of apocalyptic, post-apocalyptic in interesting ways, in ways that aren't wild and, massively horrifying, but rather deeply personal. The way that he wrote about 9/11, and as a New Yorker trying to process the horrors of the terrorist attack on 9/11 in Falling Man. And perhaps, again, he was too close to that event, and yet Players gets at many of those ideas. Ratner's Star is a great book if you're interested in what would have been like if Don DeLillo tried to be Thomas Pynchon. Great Jones Street does the same thing and is great if you're a fan of Bob Dylan. But I would really say if you're interested in who Don DeLillo was as a writer, start with his works in the 1980s, whether it's Running Dog, The Names, White Noise, Libra. And that's probably where you're going to find a lot to consider and reflect upon before hitting Underworld. But as always, let me know what your thoughts are. Let me know your suggestions. I'm always interested in the discussion we get to have and share. So hope everybody's doing well. And let me know if you enjoy the white noise adaptation. I'm certainly hopeful. Thanks.